Now, I looked at the Dreamcast before, and I wasted hours upon hours playing so many different games, and a lot of people still try to make their own homebrews and hacks. It's actually pretty neat, and it has a soft place in my heart. I didn't grow up with it when it first came out. I was a PS2 boy at the time. But I remember looking at it and I wondered, well, why didn't anyone talk about this? There have been some stuff that's been said. And, well, the truth is, Sega had quite a bit of a history of having the right idea, but the wrong technology to do so. You remember back then when the Sega Genesis was released? They were talking about blast processing and how it was so much faster than the SNES. And they capitalized on that. And that was their biggest selling point, was that it was fast. And then the CD market started to come out. So then they decided to come out with that. And there were a few attempts. There was the Philips CDI. There was the Atari Jaguar CD, which was an add-on for the Atari Jaguar. Another console I might look at some point. And then Sega tried to dip its toes onto the peripheral thing. And they ended up making what was called the Sega CD. And it had varying results. Because back in the 90s, people were really trying to capitalize on the format of the CD. They really wanted to squeeze as much as they could into it. And while it was mostly panned for some of its full motion video games, like Night Trap and, stuff of that nature, there were actually some legitimate good titles like Potful Mail, The Terminator, Snatcher, a lot of really underrated gems. There was also Space Adventures Cobra, based on the anime series. There were quite a few that I felt like deserved a chance, but never got the chance. Nintendo originally was going to have a deal with Sony, but at some point that deal broke off. They tried to go with Philips at the time, and that partnership didn't last long. And what we got out of that one was the PlayStation. But with Sega, they still wanted to compete in the market. So their next attempt on that was the Sega Saturn. Now this one is an interesting one, because the Saturn had some interesting ideas, but its marketing was not really panned towards Americans. The Japanese market was great, but the North American and European market was varying, to say the least. A lot of the developers didn't have time, or I should say, didn't have the budget to work on the games that were going to be on the hardware itself. So there were a lot of games that were in varying degrees. There are some good titles like the Panzer Dragoon series. There was Street Fighter vs. X-Men, a really good one. Burning Rangers. And there are a few more I can think of. I'll have to look on that later. But that one failed, mostly because PlayStation was just really on the top of its game. And the only other company that could compete with them was Nintendo with the N64. And while the N64 did have some pretty good titles and some pretty good graphics, the library just really couldn't compete with them in the market. So finally, Sega finally got it right with the Dreamcast. Fully optimized the CD space without compromising on quality. They also imported some of their arcade games, like House of the Dead 2, Crazy Taxi and stuff of that nature. Unfortunately, it came a little too late. By the time the GameCube, the PS2, and Xbox came into the scene, Sega really couldn't compete with it. And that was the end of that. There was actually another talk of a hidden game that was called the Neptune, which was supposed to be a predecessor of the Saturn. But I really couldn't find any information on that one. So, what drew me to the Dreamcast? Mostly, it was just how it captured the feeling of having an arcade cabinet in your home. And it was such a neat little concept. There are a lot of great titles. In fact, there's so many that I feel like I could do a whole PowerPoint on it. Which, maybe one day I will. And I don't know if I would ever have the time to really dissect it and go into it. There are definitely plenty of fighting games on there. There's definitely a lot of hacks that we could play. There's definitely some really, really good fighting games and shooters that we can play. A lot of good RPGs and stuff. Oh, and I can't forget the Sonic Adventure series. Yeah, Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 are on here. So there's a good chance we might get some of that on. But there's also a couple that I feel like people don't know too much about. There's Record of the Lotus War, based on the anime series, based on the book series. There is also Grandia 2, another underrated series. There's Code Veronica of Resident Evil, probably one of my favorite Resident Evil titles of all time. Skies of Arcadia, really underrated gem. And there's a few arcade ports that I can think of. There's actually people on so many platforms that take the Streets of Rage game engine and they sort of make it into their own little beat-em-up games. I've seen varying hacks of that. There are people who make games like, let's see, there was one with the characters of Elfen Lied. There was a really bad Resident Evil one, a really bad Sailor Moon one, and some of them were actually fun to play with. See, that's the interesting thing about Dreamcast. You can actually find new ways to play some of these games. As for some of the games that require an online mode, there actually exists servers that can be accessed if you know how to hack your console, back when K12 dial-up was the standard. So next week, we might dive into some more Dreamcast games. And I realize that some of you guys probably don't know much about Dreamcast, so